Okay. Oh yes, we are live. Welcome everybody for the evening session or morning session for Joletta of the International Days at the Academy of Allied Health. We're really welcome and really pleased to welcome Joletta Belton. She's an expert concerning patient participation in research, in collaboration, in collaborative sense. As an Well, you have so many roles, so it's very hard always to talk who you are, to say who you are, Joletta. And most of it, I'm very pleased to have you here and to talk with you and to share or to hear a little bit about your ideas. I'm very glad that we met the first time in Manchester, and now we're finally here at the Han, or actually in this online world. Joletta, up to you.
Thank you so much, and hopefully one day we'll be able to meet in person again, and I will be able to come there. Thank you so much for that warm welcome, and I'm so happy to be here to kind of share some of my story, my own narrative, and then how my story led to the advocacy work that I do, the patient partnership work that I do now, and some of the ideas that I have for the importance of narrative in relation to ethical pain care, and particularly in the realm of like justice and autonomy for patients. But I feel like it's good to kind of ground that in my own story, which is why I'm here in the first place in doing this work. For me, I was a firefighter paramedic back in the early 2000s. And during the course of my work, just on a regular call, I stepped off the fire engine awkwardly and felt a twinge in my hip. And it was just a twinge, nothing more. I didn't think much of it at the time. I continued working the rest of my shift, and I continued working for another 5 months, working my 24, 48, 72-hour shifts. I'm in a very physical job that I absolutely loved. And back at that time, if you had asked me to describe myself, I would have said I'm a firefighter, because to me that encapsulated all that I was. You know, I fought fires and saved lives for a living. I was really strong and fit and prided myself in that strength and fitness. I was really competitive. I was one of only 22 women in a department of almost 1,000 firefighters. So there was 22 women and almost 1,000 men. So it was really competitive. I really had to prove myself all the time and really prided myself in being able to hold my own and be considered like one of the guys. And then this stupid little twinge totally set me down a different path that was completely unexpected. The twinge became painful over time, and over time I started to lose function too. And I did seek care for it through our workers' compensation system and went to PT. I took medications. Ultimately, I had to go off work altogether. And that was when, in retrospect and looking back and reflecting back on my experience, when things really started to go kind of wrong for me. Because all of a sudden now I was home all the time and I wasn't at work. Whereas before this, I was used to being at the station and working as a firefighter more than I was at home. I was used to being with my crew and the guys that I worked with more than being with my husband. And now suddenly my whole world was totally upended. And I was no longer doing those things, working as a firefighter, working out on my days off, running, being really active. I was not able to do those things that made me feel like myself anymore. And my world started to become really, really small. And I became really withdrawn from the people around me, from the experiences that I used to enjoy, from the activities that I used to enjoy, because I didn't understand what was going on in my hip. And I was really, really worried about what was going on in my hip and how that was going to impact my future. My biggest fear was not being able to go back to work. My biggest fear was not being able to go back to the career that I had wholly kind of identified myself by, and that I had planned to retire from. So my whole future kind of was in jeopardy because of this pain that I had in my hip, and now being off work and away from work and completely removed from the environment that I was used to spending the most of my time in. I was also in a very adversarial system at this time where I felt like I had to constantly prove that I was in pain, that I had to constantly prove that it was real, that I was suffering for it, and that I was deserving of care. And having to constantly prove that my pain was real, it's essentially having to constantly prove that you're a trustworthy human, that you're a human of worth and value, and that you are deserving of care and deserving of having this pain treated in some way. And that's a very exhausting and demoralizing position to be in when you're already feeling pretty low because of the pain itself. And then it comes within this context of that pain not being believed because it's invisible. I mean, it just happened. It was just a twinge in my hip. You couldn't see anything externally. There wasn't some big traumatic event that led to this pain. It wasn't this obvious thing that could be verified just visually. So I had to be trusted, and I didn't really feel like I was trusted in that care environment that I was in. And that was really, really difficult. Ultimately, I had, while I was still working, I had physical therapy and medications. And when I went off work, I had injections, and then I had surgery. And in my paperwork, I failed all of those treatments. So I failed physical therapy, I failed injections, I failed surgery because my pain didn't go away. With the surgery, my anatomy was fixed in my hip. I had been diagnosed with femoral acetabular impingement, and the surgeon did a beautiful job and fixed my anatomy, and the inside of my hip looks beautiful now, but I still had pain. So even though my anatomy was fixed, my pain was not fixed. And that was really disconcerting to me too, because I had all of these expectations going in that surgery was the ultimate fix and that surgery should then fix me. And it didn't. And so all of those fears and worries about not being able to go back to work, because now it was supposed to be after surgery. Finally, I was going to be able to go back to work. I was going to be able to go back to being me, going back to being myself again. And then that was no longer possible. I couldn't sit during this time. So sitting was my most painful activity, and not being able to sit meant that my life was really limited. Not being able to sit meant not being able to be in a car, not being able to sit on public transportation. It meant not being able to meet a friend for a drink, or to go out to dinner with my husband, or to go to the movies. I couldn't even watch movies sitting on my own couch because it was so unbearably uncomfortable. I would have to lie flat on the ground with my head under our coffee table to watch TV. Being so limited, it just made my world smaller and smaller over time. And I didn't like who I was in this state because I didn't feel like myself. So I didn't really want to engage with other people because what was I going to do? And I felt like I would just be a burden on my friends or my family. So I just stopped talking to everyone and withdrew further and further into this kind of shell of my former self. During that time, after failing all of these treatments, then within the healthcare system I was in, I was essentially told, we did all of the things that are possible to do. You had the ultimate thing, surgery, and it didn't work. There's nothing more that we can do. I was declared permanent and stationary, which essentially was a medical legal decree that I was never going to get better, that this was as good as it's going to get. And I was in such an awful place at that time that was like a life sentence of the rest of my life is just going to be pain and suffering because I cannot make sense of this pain. And I have no idea now how to move forward with it because all of my options have run out within the traditional kind of biomedical system that I was in. That was an incredibly low point for me because it didn't appear that there was any way forward. Thankfully, that's not where I ended up, but I share all of that because I think it provides context for this. And all of this was even more, it didn't make sense because I was an athlete my whole life. I mean, that's kind of what led me to be a firefighter in the first place. I was competitive. I was a athlete. I was really good at sports, and I had a ton of injuries throughout my lifetime. I had compound tib-fib fractures where my bone was sticking out of my shin. I fractured my elbow. I've broken my nose 4 times. Had to have reconstructive surgery twice. So before my hip surgery, I had already had surgery under anesthesia for various injuries 3 times. So it didn't make any sense to me that this twinge would lead to all of this total upending of myself and my life because I had recovered well from every single injury prior to this, and I didn't have any pain problems with any of them. So it made it all the more confusing, and I didn't have any good explanations for it at the time. And like I said, I felt like I had to constantly prove that the pain was even there, especially after my surgery, when it was fixed, when supposedly it was fixed. But I share all of that. But if you were to look into my medical file, if you look at my medical record, which is really, really thick over the course of these years that I'm referring to, none of that is in there. None of my story, none of my distress, none of my worries, none of my concerns, none of my fears for the future, none of my history of who I was as a person is in that medical record. My medical record reads very much like the story of a hip, just the joint. It's a hip that had this pain, and the hip received all these treatments, and the hip was fixed by surgery, and somehow the hip still has pain. But the person that hip, is a part of is kind of missing from the story altogether. My voice, my perspective, my knowledge about my experience is missing from that record altogether. And it's not an uncommon experience in the medical field in general, in the healthcare field in general. It's interesting to go back through my medical record too and see things like the goals that were set for me during my care. Because if you were to ask me during that time what my goals were, they would have been to sit, to be able to meet a friend for a drink, to be able to walk my dog around the block without feeling so much discomfort and worry and concern about my hip, and to not be like fully focused on my hip, to just be able to have a conversation with someone without just focusing on the pain in my hip. Those were my goals. Those were the things that I wanted to do. At one point, I wasn't even getting back to work anymore. It was just being able to sit in a car so I could go to the store. But if you read my medical file, my goals were to increase my range of motion to 95 degrees and then 100 degrees. It was to do, 10 sets of exercises 3 times a week. It was all these goals that had nothing to do with my values, with the things that I wanted to get back to in my life, to my valued activities and things that made me feel like myself. Oh, those are missing from my file too. And it's something that I never thought about until I heard another patient sharing their story at the San Diego Pain Summit, where she actually showed her goals on the screen from what her goals would have been and what is actually in her file. So I think it's a very common thing that we miss the person. We miss the person that is living with pain. And so our care, even though we strive for it to be patient-centered, it is often problem-centered or part-centered or diagnosis-centered. And it's not really about the person. It's about a very narrow subset of who that person is and what they're experiencing. And when it comes to pain, I mean, we all understand now that pain isn't just the symptoms that are felt in a body part, that it's this lived experience that affects all aspects of a person's life and self. During the course of my care too, I was given a bunch of labels I saw a lot of clinicians, upwards of like 20 clinicians over the course of 3 years, or in different therapists, from physical therapists and 3 different orthopedic doctors and an orthopedic surgeon, just like an occupational doctor. There was a lot of people that I saw during the course of my care, and a lot of physical therapists over those 3 years. And depending on the person that I saw and the lens through which they viewed my hip through, I got new labels and new diagnoses that were often around some type of damage, if I was seeing physicians, or some type of dysfunction, if I was seeing more of the allied health professionals, like movement dysfunctions, postural dysfunctions. And I was diagnosed with all sorts of dysfunctions and disorders, whether it be structural or in my movement posture, the way that I sat, the way that I lied, the way that I moved, the way that I interacted with the world. And it was always different. depending on the person that I saw. I was told a lot of things like I was out of alignment, or one person told me my spine was twisted on its axis, which I still don't know what that means, and it still gives me like the heebie-jeebies. I was told that my hip pain was because of the broken leg that I had when I was 16, and now I was in my 30s, and that didn't make any, I'm like, what? It didn't really bother me when I was 16. Why is it causing my hip pain now? And so I was given all these explanations, just piled one on top of another over the course of years, and it all just became a part of my belief system about myself. You know, I was disordered, I was dysfunctional, I was damaged. And in addition to that, I had all of these no's in my paperwork. No lifting, no squatting, no running, no climbing, no awkward positions. Those all became a part of my belief system about myself too. Not that I shouldn't do those things, but that I couldn't do those things. So then over time, I just gradually became this damaged, dysfunctional, disordered person who couldn't do anything. And that became such a limiting factor in my life too, and a really hard thing to overcome. So much of the language in my care was very negative and about all the things that were wrong with me. And very rarely was it ever about all of the things that were right with me and all of the possibilities that lay before me, even if I had some functional limitations or limitations due to pain. Eventually, I started a nonprofit that we called the Endless Possibilities Initiative. And I started it with a friend of mine who was paraplegic, because we really wanted to focus on the endless possibilities within anyone's existence, no matter what their limitations are. And that boundaries are just a way of getting creative to figure out how to engage with the things that make you feel like you and the things that you value within whatever those limits are. So I think maybe, I don't know if it would be a good time to start talking about this, if this raises any questions or things that we could explore a little bit more in depth, or if you want me to jump into tying this into kind of the justice stuff as well when it comes to like epistemic injustice and testimonial injustice.
Joletta, I think that this story already is quite rich in experiences and a lot of things. So I'm just curious what the other ones here think about it.
Yes, I agree. It's really a rich story, and well, I have many questions, but maybe a first question. You also told that after well, during the pain, you didn't feel that this is not me. At the moment, how are you doing, and who are you now?
Oh, what a beautiful question. So I'm doing really well now. I still have hip pain. It flares up from time to time, but it's no longer like a focus of my life. It's something that I don't notice very often. I could notice it. I'm sure if I focused a lot of attention on it and thought about it a lot, that I could bring it to the fore more often, and it would become more of a dominant presence in my life. But I've learned so much about pain since I was in active care. So the path I took kind of out of that chaos, out of that abyss of pain that I was in, was to go to graduate school, which is not a desirable treatment path, I think, for most people. But I really wanted to understand my pain better. So I went back to graduate school in human movement, because I had very biomechanical and biomedical notions of what pain was. And I really felt like if I could just fix my movement more, that I would be able to fix my pain. When I was a firefighter, I was a peer fitness trainer for us. So I thought I knew a lot about movement and anatomy and biomechanics and all of that. Took a couple weekend classes and knew everything. But so I thought that, and I had a lot of ideas about pain and how to fix pain from knowing very little about things. So I went back to graduate school and studied human movement, but I studied pain science as my research focus. And it was in studying the science of pain and kind of the biology, neurobiology of pain, that I came to understand pain differently. And for me, it helped me to decouple the idea that pain equals injury or pain equals damage. And that message was very reinforced throughout my care. As everyone knows, the US is particularly messed up in a lot of things, but in our workers' compensation system, they don't treat pain, they only treat injuries. So if you have persisting pain, it's continually labeled as an injury. So it just reinforces those notions that pain means you are still injured, or that you're constantly re-injuring yourself, or that you're doing more damage to yourself if you are still experiencing pain or you have more pain. So, I mean, that was reinforced to me over those 3 years. So it took some work when I first kind of learned about pain being more multi-system in whole person. And that, like, it wasn't just my anatomy that was involved, that my nervous system, my immune system, my endocrine system, that all of these systems were involved, and that context really mattered, which I could relate to my own experiences. There were certain contexts that my pain was unbearable, and then others not so much. If I was doing something that I enjoyed, I didn't notice pain as much. So I could kind of start taking what I was learning and apply it to my own experiences. And then over time, but I also, at first, when I was learning this stuff, I was like, that makes a lot of sense for everybody else, but my pain is real. And that notion came from this idea that for pain to be real, it has to be something that you can physically see on a scan or an x-ray, or something that can be fixed by surgery or a pill or some type of invasive intervention, that it should be something that could just be found and taken out. So there was this evolution of thought for me that, yes, my pain is real. It's just real in different ways than I understood it to be before, that it's not tied so much to my anatomy, that it's more related to my personhood. And so when I had this new understanding, I became less fearful that I was doing more damage to myself with more pain. And I was able to start engaging with the things that mattered to me more and more over time, because I wasn't so worried about every painful step I'm taking and doing more damage to my hip, and I'm going to have another surgery, or I messed up my surgery, which were all thoughts that I used to have. And then the more I started engaging with things that I valued and that made me feel like me, the less centered my pain became in my life. It kind of moved off to the side, and I could center other things in my life. Like I had said, I become really withdrawn from everything, from people, but also just from experiences, from doing things. I have been someone who has gone camping since I was 3 months old. With my mom, took me on my first camping trip when I was 3 months old. And in nature, being out in nature is something that I have always found home in and found solace in, and where I've always felt most like myself. But when I was in this pain for these 3 years, I never went outside. I rarely left my house. You know, I was in a single room of my house for the majority of my existence, and didn't even go out into the garden. So it was like taking small steps back into just being outside. And I started taking pictures. I started taking pictures of like snails and butterflies and birds in my backyard. And it helped me to start seeing the world again, in a wholly different way, like literally looking at the world through a different lens, rather than being so focused on looking at my hip and centered on my hip and centering my entire existence around my hip. It became more about being immersed in the world again, and recognizing how beautiful and interesting the world still was, despite my absence from it for so long. And then the more I did that, the more that all took up more of my space and time and capacity, and the pain kind of took up less time and space and capacity. And then got back to living again, much differently than being a firefighter, but still engaging with my values of wanting to be of service, wanting to help out my community, wanting to do those things, which I do now through pain advocacy work and those sorts of things.
And I hear that you say, well, me as a person is well more in the center, but at the same time, I also hear that you say the pain is still there. And now I'm using some of the findings of my study about chronic pain, where the participants in my study describe different phases. And some of the phases is that they say, well, my aim is to control and to reduce the pain. And the final phase, at least for some participants, is that they said, well, now I realize that I can collaborate with the pain. I can use the pain as a kind of advisor. Well, which phase or state, whatever you want to call it, do you think you are?
Well, so for me, I think I definitely transitioned from a place where I was like in a holding pattern, where I was waiting for the pain to be gone to get back with life. I wanted to reduce pain. I wanted to control pain. I wanted everything that I did. Like if I meditated, I had this very distinct goal of meditating to reduce my pain, and it never worked. Or I was doing specific things to reduce my pain, and it never worked. And then when I shifted my focus to maybe I can make space for pain and engage with these other things, maybe I could meditate just to meditate rather than having a goal of that meditation, then it all started to help. And the pain actually started to change when it was no longer my sole focus. So it was very much a learning to live with and alongside rather than trying to get rid of it and fight it in order to live. And so now I live well with pain, and pain is definitely a part of who I am and has shaped who I am now. But it's not my identity. And it was for a time. It very much was for a time, especially when I lost all of those labels of my career, of being a firefighter, of being an athlete, of being a runner. Like I had all these labels that I had identified myself by, and then I lost them all. And so I was just grasping at, well, what am I now? And now I'm a chronic pain patient, or I'm a pain patient. I'm a person who lives with pain. And then it was this like that need to identify myself in some way. And then I was a student because I went back to school, and then I was like fearful of graduating. So I'm like, what am I when I graduate? Because now I have no idea what the future holds for me. What label can I ascribe to myself? And it's just so interesting how much we strive for those labels. And for a long time, pain was a part of that, my own personal pain. Now it is part of the labels that I have because I'm an advocate, but now I'm an advocate for people living with pain, not an advocate for myself or my own pain. It's the work that I do now is more, I'm removed from it in the sense that it's for others, not for myself.
And one last, question, remark, and then time for and space for some other questions. In narrative research, they often talk a lot about storylines. And they say that in a bigger narrative, you have different storylines. And when I hear you talking about the different labels and questioning who am I and what is the pain, I think you can, well, in a way say that in your bigger narrative, you presented yourself as a firefighter. That's one storyline. As a athlete, that's another storyline. Joletta, the daughter, is also a storyline. But then the pain came in as a storyline. And now maybe other storylines develop. And it's interesting for me, but I think for all of us and also in education to think about what kind of storylines do you have? And from a professional perspective, how do we label that? And yes, if we are educated in a biomedical way, the only labels or storylines we know is pain or a hip or a joint. And if we look a little bit further, yes, then we recognize, well, it's you, a person, a human, the firefighter, etc. So yeah, I have much more questions, but just to finish this part, and then we can go on with other questions.
Well, I'm really glad that you brought that up too, because it is interesting. Our larger narrative does include all of these different stories, and those stories change over time too. You know, the way I tell my story now is different than the way I told it 5 years ago. Is definitely different than the way I told it when I was still in that darkness in the abyss, when I could barely put words to my experience because I didn't know how to. I didn't know how to talk about it back when I was kind of in the depths. I didn't have the capacity or the tools to be able to do so. And it's part of why I share my story now, to help others to to find their own ability to express themselves, because it's really hard. We don't do a very good job just in society as a whole of talking about hard things, and pain is a hard thing, and it affects all aspects of a person's life, and there can be so much shame and guilt associated with that pain. I experienced so much shame, which is another huge storyline that threads through so many of the other stories in my own narrative. Like, I was so ashamed that I didn't get better when I should have. I was ashamed that I had pain in the first place. The thing that I fought, I grew up in Detroit. I don't know if you have any familiarity with Detroit, but Detroit is a hard city. It's a very blue collar city, and they're strong people who have always had to fight for what they have. I come from a very blue collar family. My dad was a carpenter. My mom was a florist. They never had much and would give everything that they have. It was a family where you weren't hurt unless there was blood and bone showing, and otherwise you just walked it off. So like, I grew up in this kind of tough existence. So the worst thing that you could call me was weak. And this whole pain experience for me, and thinking of myself as weak, being labeled as weak by healthcare professionals, and not knowing whether that meant my hip was weak or my core was weak, or if I was weak of character or weak of constitution or weak just because I'm not getting better. Because so much of my care, especially in physical therapy, was focused on getting strong. And I mean, I was a firefighter, so I have a bit of an ego and was arrogant. I was strong. Like, I could lift guys who weighed twice as much as me and carry them over my shoulder, because that was a part of my job. Strength was not an issue for me. My core was very stable. Those things were not an issue. Yet that seemed to be the focus of a lot of my care. And I think that part of that was because I wasn't known as a person during that. So it was just this universal, this is what I do for people who have hip pain, rather than this is what I'm going to do with Joletta to figure out what's right for her. So I think that learning those stories is so valuable. And then the stories aren't fixed. They're not concrete. So we can reflect back differently on our experiences. It can take on different meanings, have new meanings. And then the chapters moving forward are yet to be written. Those are still yet to be written. And that's where I think that clinicians and healthcare professionals have such an amazing opportunity to help people living with pain, because they're going to help that person in pain write the future chapters, write a new story, write a new storyline that could be filled with all of the things that are going right in their life and all of the things that are right with them, and in all of the possibilities that their future can hold. And that narrative can be created together between the person living with pain, who brings their own knowledge and expertise. When it comes to that epistemic injustice or testimonial injustice, is often not valued. What they bring to the conversation is often not valued, and it's dismissed or talked over or not believed. But they bring their expertise in themselves and their pain and their experience and what matters to them. And that, coupled with the expertise of the clinician, the healthcare professional, can come together to create a new story, a new narrative that makes biological sense, because that's important. It's important that the things that we do are based in science and our current understanding of pain, but also biographical sense. It has to make sense for that person in particular, their unique story, their unique self.
And what triggers me is that you say, well, a narrative, a story is not fixed. That's right. It can always change. But I just took this paper. I don't know if you can see it.
I'm going to pin you so that you're bigger.
You see the narrative? Oh, yeah. The narrative with different storylines, and I will read a little bit what the stroke clients, I also did a study in stroke clients, what they told about the beginning of their narrative after the stroke. They talked about chaos. I also heard you talking about chaos. They talked about uncertainty. That's also what you said. They talked about loss of self. That's also what I heard about you. Then on a certain moment, they talk about the experience of mastery. On the moment that they do activities again, they feel, oh yeah, I'm able to do that. Just to show that every individual narrative, that's not fixed. You can always develop. but for the students, for us as professionals, we can learn from a lot of narratives that are already described. But before I go on, I have to leave the floor to others.
Now, I think it's a tremendous, nice conversation, and I think that this brings something extra to it. Well, especially for me being a physiotherapist, that's also directly seeing the value of interdisciplinary collaboration, because now we see directly what it is also for some of the physios around here. That what does it mean if you work with each other? Seem, you raise your hand before we answer. We start taking the questions. Seem, I thought that Seem raised his hand, and he has a question or remark.
Well, yes, you said you tried meditating to lower your pain, and that didn't help. And then you came to the realization that it didn't help because you meditated to lower pain and not meditate to meditate. And that's a realization. But how you can't really tell a person that or teach a person that.
Yeah, and I think that's important to recognize too. Like so much of this, and I think our current systems are problematic not just for patients, but for you all too, for healthcare professionals too, because it puts you in this position where I have to fix this person, when that's not a really realistic or tenable expectation to have. You can guide that person, you can facilitate their growth and their knowledge, but you can't do it for them. They're going to have to come to some of these understandings themselves. And some of that is going to come through failing at things and things not working out. And so I think approaching things as more of like an exploration, being curious about things and trying to engender that in the person you're talking to can be really helpful. Because I also think meditation was presented to me as something that could lower pain. So it was in the presentation of it too, that gave me the expectation that if I meditate, my pain is going to lower, rather than the things that I could learn from meditation that might help over time. And I still meditate now. I meditate almost daily. I would like to say daily, but that's not true. I aspire to daily. But the things that I learned from it that actually ultimately helped with my pain were things like self-compassion. You know, like being kinder to myself was one of the huge things that I learned from meditation. And I think a lot of people who live with pain might have perfectionist tendencies like me. A lot of healthcare professionals have perfectionist tendencies too. But so and I was someone who thought I got to where I am by being really hard on myself and driving myself hard. So I took that into my experience with pain too. And I'm like, I just have to be harder on myself in order to get better. And that was not helpful at all. So meditation, it was a guided meditation practice that I had started, really helped me to just be kinder and more compassionate with myself, which was a huge challenge for me because, as I said, I didn't grow up like in this compassionate, like touchy-feely kind of environment. It was kind of a tough, very independent, individualistic kind of environment where you pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you get it done yourself. And if you want a job done right, you do it yourself. Like all of these kinds of things were a part of how I grew up and how I believed and how I operated in the world. So to be nice to myself was something I was like, whoa, that doesn't seem right. That seems a little too like wishy-washy and soft. You know, that's not strong, that's weak. And so for myself, I had to come to a new understanding of what that was, and that there is strength in self-compassion and caring for yourself and being nice to yourself. There is strength in vulnerability and honesty and owning up to the parts of yourself that you might not like very much, or and accepting the things that you cannot change. You might wish things were different, but that just leads to strife and struggling, rather than accepting where you are in this moment and being able to go from there. But so that's not something you can teach like in a session to someone. Those understandings, those realizations aren't something that someone can come to. But I think trying to foster exploration and reflection can lead to those kind of epiphanies for people over time. Probably not a satisfactory answer, though.
That's okay.
Did it help, Sim?
Yes.
Yes.
And
I did.
this also sounds a little bit like it's also an approach, the ACT, the acceptance commitment therapy. You have to accept, and then you can commit, and the words you are using is also about being kind to yourself. Accept that, well, you are you, the pain is there, accept it. And ACT is also quite successful in pain rehabilitation. But I don't think that you have, well, followed that kind of program, but you more or less did it yourself.
Exactly. I actually have said that before in previous talks, that I kind of did act to myself. And acceptance is such a hard topic for people living with pain, and it's a very nuanced topic, because oftentimes I think people hear the word acceptance and they mean they have to accept everything, or that everything is okay. Where a lot of people have been mistreated in their care. When it comes to things like testimonial injustice, people aren't believed, or their stories are dismissed because of the identities they might have. Women are less believed than men are. People of color are less believed than white people. People who are in the LGBTQIA community are believed less than cis people. Like, it's all of these different injustices that people can experience, that it's not about accepting those things that might contribute to someone's pain or to their experience in the world. It's not about accepting mistreatment or injustice. It's about accepting for yourself where you are in this moment, because resisting having pain isn't going to help that person in that moment. Being able to make space for that pain can help them to open up some capacity and move forward in a different way. So I think that for a lot of people, acceptance can be met with resistance, because it's thought that to mean I should accept that all of these other things that are going on, rather than it being for that individual, and not, perhaps if they were mistreated, not accepting that they were mistreated, but accepting, like, because that's not acceptable, but accepting where they are in this moment in order to be able to move forward.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. You already touched some of the topics like testimonial injustice and ethical justice, so we definitely need to go a little bit towards the uneasy areas. Just in between, from the chat box, I got some questions, and for my good friend Matthew Lowe, he's listening with us from YouTube.
Hi, Matt.
And Matthew says, "Hi, Joletta, always great to see you, and thank you for all your insight, of which I continue to learn every time I hear your story." His question: how might an otherwise healthcare system become in ways that may have changed the course of your story?
So I think that the first thing that I think would have been transformative. It's interesting, because I think some of the solutions to the problems that we have are probably simple, if not easy, and it comes from just learning who that person is in front of you and hearing their story, and because I don't think you can understand someone's pain if you don't understand them, because their pain is contextual. It's about their experiences that have led up to who they are as a person, and also the current context that they're within, whether that's biological context, things that are going on in their body, and also the situational context that they're in, their environment, their culture, their identity. All of these things are always mixed up in it. So if you know nothing about any of that, and all you know about is pain in general, it's going to be really hard to help an individual person. So I think everything always just has to start with listening to that person and understanding them a little bit more. It's why I love the question, or the way of phrasing it, like, tell me your story, rather than tell me about your pain, or tell me about your problem, or tell me why you're here today, because that already limits that person to a very narrow focus of having to talk about their symptoms and the duration and the quality of them, and it becomes about the part again, and it's not about the person. Where if they're able to say, this is who I am, this is how pain is affecting me, in whatever way that comes out for them, will provide so many insights for you as a healthcare professional or as a healthcare system into how to best help that person, which overall for the systems, it's going to lead to better care and better outcomes and more return on investment and less return visits and all of those things over time, because the really important things are hit upon earlier rather than years down the line, which is when they, like often for people, it's years into their experience, they finally find that one clinician that listens. And then they'll say, you're the first person who's ever listened to me. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard that from people. You're the first person who has asked me that. You're the first person to really listen to me. How do we build that into systems and structures where that happens for every patient earlier on in their experience?
But may I ask you a question? I'm also thinking about, can you change the system? I'm also in a project group in Amsterdam, where we have proposed a new process of goal setting. Where we talk about you first have to ask for the global goals, and you can link it with what are the values of a person. And in that group, they say, well, the first interview with a client should be done by a physician and a chaplain. Really a chaplain, yes. And not in every setting there is a chaplain, or in Dutch a kapelaan, or at least somebody who has a good understanding about what is the meaning of life.
Right.
I strongly believe that really works when you talk about goals. At the other side, and that's a question also to you and the others, do you think that every client that we meet as professional is ready to talk about global goals, or do they first want to talk about pain?
I think every person is going to be different, and I think it's really hard to talk about goals if a person is still in a place of not being able to make sense of where they are right now, and that oftentimes we jump to the fix, or we jump to the treatment plan, or the way to help this person get out of the situation that they're in, without helping them to make better sense of the situation that they're in. That's why they're seeking care. It doesn't make sense to them, or they don't know how to go about it. So I think that goals are important, but it always has to be within a context of that person being able to make sense of where they are, so that they're not in the chaos anymore. Like if you're in chaos, you can't make a goal. Like if you're in the abyss, it's like goals are essentially meaningless. Like the goal is to get out of the abyss. And that comes through better understanding of the experience that you're going through, and just seeing kind of a ray of hope, some possibility that the abyss isn't your forever, that this isn't, you're not permanent and stationary. This isn't your plateau and you're never going to get better. I think that's the message that so many people, especially with ongoing pain, chronic pain, persistent pain, whatever you call it, so many of them, that's what they've been left with. There's nothing more that can be done. This is your forever. Nothing is going to get better. There's nothing that we can do. And that frustrates me no end, because there's always something that can be done. Whether that just be listening to a person and sitting with them in their suffering, and acknowledging them as a human, validating them as a human, validating their experiences, acknowledging how difficult it is and how much it sucks. That alone can lift a burden for people that they didn't even know they were carrying until they receive that listening, that acknowledgement, that validation. But we often skip over that part. We forget that people might need that, and we kind of jump forward. One thing that I always think is, I just had this conversation the other day, is that we call it an interview rather than a conversation. So that implies that I'm going to interrogate this patient to learn more about them, rather than have a conversation so that we can come to a mutual understanding of who this person is, who I am as a clinician, as a healthcare professional, as a human, and how we're going to come together to figure out what's going on and find a way forward. So I think just dispositionally, we situate ourselves where we maintain this power imbalance between the person in pain and the person who is treating them, where they're always placed in this position of interrogation rather than on equal footing and having a conversation. I wish we could become more conversationalists. Let's have a conversation. about you and what you're going through, about, you know, how we can figure this out together. One of my favorite questions that comes up from, or that came up in a conference once from a family medical doctor was, you know, what concerns you the most? It's such a beautiful question because it can really provide insights into what that person, what needs to be addressed most urgently for that person. And it might not be anything that the healthcare professional would think that they would come up with. You know, it could be something like, I'm worried I will never be able to get down on the ground again. Like something, or I will never be able to lift my grandchild, or I'll never be able to drive a car again. You know, like things that some of their concerns might be easily assuaged if we just know what they are. But oftentimes people are never asked. So I think for me, one of the frustrating things in my care was I told everyone under the sun that I couldn't sit, and that it was the most distressing thing for me because it was the most life-limiting thing for me, and it was never addressed. What I did more of was more step-ups to the treatment table, more walking lunges, more clamshells, more exercises that and none of it helped me to sit. None of it helped me to get over my concerns about doing more damage to my hip. No one ever disavowed me of those concerns or those worries. They were, if anything, they were just reinforced over time. Yeah. Because so much of what I had to do was fixing my posture, fixing my movement. So it just reinforced these notions of the way that I'm moving now, the way that I'm sitting now is doing more harm to my structures. And that is bad. But that just not being able to sit was never acknowledged. And when I finally was able to kind of start sitting, the solutions for it were the complete opposite of so much of what I had heard, which was like sit up straight, shoulders back, like all this stuff. It was like to slouch, to relax, to do all of these things, which were so counterintuitive for me. But so I think just little things like being someone, knowing who I was, which was pretty obvious when I came in. I mean, I was deadlifting more than twice my body weight. I could bench press a lot. I could do 24 strict, maybe not 24. I think my number has grown over the years, but I could do a lot of strict pull-ups. and looking back, the number keeps getting bigger than it was at the time. Like I was a really strong person at that time, but that was never taken into consideration during my care. What I probably needed more of was rest. What I probably need more of was not doing quite so much and not being so freaking hard on myself, you know, but I, as a person, was never considered. It was just this kind of rote way of treating hip pain. And so I think that's something that can be done within any system and within any clinic, within any medical office, is just taking into account that person in front of you and really having individualized care rather than just check boxes of this is what I do for hip pain, because you're never treating hip pain. You are treating a person that has pain in their hip. Yeah. So I think, I don't know if I answered your question at all, Matt, but I would say listening, contextualizing every treatment path within the program that someone is within with that person, have conversations and that sort of thing.
It seems like Matt is agreeing. Following his chats. So I have his chat on my telephone in the meantime. But in the meantime, this is great. Whenever he gets something more. Amber had a question. Amber, please.
Yes, I heard you a lot about some frustrating about telling about your pain, and you are ashamed that you have that pain. And I have a question from a patient's perspective. My question is that have you often felt that you have to justify your pain to other people because they didn't understand the pain, because they didn't know what the pain was like? And how did you feel about that? Was it even more frustrating to tell your story a lot, even they didn't understand it? Or did it give you some support because you're telling your story to them?
It's such a great question, and I definitely have experienced that, where I have to feel like I have to justify my pain, and it can even come from other patients in this work, in this pain advocacy work, where your experience can be doubted by other people who are also advocating for people in pain, and that's incredibly hurtful because we all experience pain differently, and that when we do it to each other, I think it's even harder to bear. Like, I can almost understand it when it comes from healthcare professionals, because they were taught within systems that kind of put doubt at the forefront of the mind rather than belief. But I go through phases like every single year about whether sharing my story is good for me or bad for me, because and it comes down to that sometimes, where I do have to kind of justify my pain in a sense, like my existence and my ability to do this work and share this, and balancing that with the people who do get something from it when I do a presentation or when I do talk about my pain. And it will always come in the form of when I'm at my lowest point with all of this, when I'm exhausted by it or feeling particularly demoralized by sharing my story and potentially feeling that injustice or that sense of having to defend myself or justify myself. It invariably happens where I get an email or a message from someone that talks about how much it impacted their life or the work that they do with their patients. And so then it always makes it worth it for me, because even if it just reaches one person, if just one person from this session or that is watching on YouTube gets something out of it, to me, then it's worth it. It's worth doing it, at least for now, today. Then there's other days where I'm lower, where I'm like, it's because it is exhausting, and I'm better at being vulnerable now than I used to be. It was really, really hard in the beginning to put myself out there, because you're putting yourself out there. You're not putting out like a theory or an idea that can be challenged or a treatment approach that can be challenged. And then you're talking about the idea or the theory or the treatment approach. Like, this is me. This is my life that I'm putting out there. So it's scary every single time. But I often get so much back in return that it makes it worthwhile. But it is emotionally exhausting at times, for sure. I don't know if that answered your question, but
yes, it is.
And
Thank you.
I do it too because it's hard, but I want more people to be able to share their stories too, because I think it's really helpful, not just for healthcare professionals, but for patients too, to learn that they're not alone in their experiences, that someone else has gone through something similar to them. And healthcare professionals can be patients too, can live with pain, can experience all of these things too. I've met a lot of physical therapists in particular that have had FAI or similar types of hip pain that I have had. And I think that the more that we can talk about uncomfortable and hard things, the better it is for all of us, because then it doesn't make it such a burden to bear, because having to not talk about it is even harder than being able to talk about it. There's so much stigma and shame that can be associated with sharing your story, that I hope by sharing more stories, we can reduce that stigma and shame.
May I react on this? When I hear you talking about the question, well, do you have to justify the pain? I hear in a way two sides. At least that's my interpretation. I hear you talking as a kind of, let's say, educator. I want to explain to others that there are people with real pain. And I also hear, and that's also what I heard in the study that I did, is that sometimes for some people who don't believe you as a patient with pain, that you have to justify. For me, those are two different roles. Sometimes in the role as patient, you, and sometimes in the role as, well, I would say a kind of educator.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, I'm fortunate that I haven't been a patient much lately. So for me, it comes more in the role of whatever I'm doing here, educator, advocate, whatever you want to call me in this
And
kind of space.
that's a new role, I can imagine, with a lot of meaning.
Yes, and I think that's an important aspect of it too. It does give me a sense of meaning and purpose and value that I do feel like I'm still being of service in some way, which is a value that I've always held, which led me to being a firefighter in the first place, was to be of service to my community and to get to do fun things as a firefighter. But being of service was important too.
That makes sense. It's nice to have this different perspective that we constantly hear, because it's this variation that you started with also, Joletta, from the first time, that it's not, Joletta is a kind of a complex, you are complex, like every person is complex with a lot of sides to it, and that's nice what you just bring out to it. Just to go a little bit further, not a question, Samantha and Seem had both a question. Samantha, please.
Yeah, I had a question about the vision of the healthcare professionals you experienced, or rather your experience about that. We talked about the biomedical labeling, and do you think this is rather an established way of reasoning from the healthcare professional, or maybe the uncertainty of this healthcare professional because your pain wouldn't fit into a certain pattern?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. It's interesting because I just saw on Twitter, where you get, so it has to be true and all of the best information is on Twitter. But one of the healthcare professionals, who's a GP, wrote about his own kind of transformation as a physician and going to this other end of the spectrum where he just tried to explain pain to all of his patients, like this complexity of pain, kind of like a pain neuroscience approach. And that in part that was based on his own uncertainty and wanting to like prove that he knows what he's talking about. And I feel like from my perspective, that's kind of true even for myself. Like I wanted to explain pain to everyone when I started to understand it differently. Because I'm like, oh, if all patients just understand pain the way that I understand pain now, it's going to help them all. Like it's that simple. They just need to do the same thing I did, and then they're going to be fine. And that's not how it works. That's not true at all, because everybody is different. I think early on in my care, it was a very biomechanical, structural kind of approach, in that they just thought it was soft tissue. And so the approach was, I don't think there was much clinical reasoning when it came to deciding what my initial care was. I did what I called like triathlons, where I went to physical therapy and I did the bike for 15 minutes. I ran on the treadmill for 15 minutes, and I did a stair climbing machine for 15 minutes. Now, I don't understand what the clinical reasoning behind doing those triathlons would be for me and for what I was experiencing in my hip at that time. So, and I don't know where that comes from. I don't know why that would be the course of action, but I did that for 8 weeks and things got worse. I didn't get better. And then I went to a new physical therapist after that, and the focus was very much on strength training. And for both of those, I think it's just when you have pain, I think part of the belief system at that time, this was in 2010, was that pain is associated with weakness, that pain is weakness of whatever body part is experiencing pain, or the body part's not experiencing pain, but you know what I mean, hopefully. So if it's the back, it's core stability, it's core strengthening that we need to do. If it's the hip, we need to strengthen the hip. If it's the knee, we need to strengthen the surrounding muscles to fix that pain. So I think that was kind of the reasoning process behind my early care, but didn't really make sense for me as a person because strength wasn't my issue at that time. I wasn't a sedentary person. So even within that reasoning, if you think that pain is caused because muscles are weak or a person is sedentary, that didn't apply to me at that time. So I mean, I can't speak for the healthcare professionals that I saw then, but I'm not sure what the reasoning was for my initial care. And then I had surgery. After surgery, I think it was a little bit different because the expectation was that surgery should fix it. So now I became a complex pain case. Now I was a chronic pain case kind of person, because the biomedical explanation, the structural explanation, and the solution for that, the fix for that didn't work. So I do think that there was some sense of I don't know what this is. I don't know what to do about this. But that was never relayed or conveyed to me. And I think that there is value in healthcare professionals saying, this is what I know about pain and what I understand of you. This is what I don't know. And being able to own some of that uncertainty, because you can't have all the answers. You can't know all of the things, especially when it comes to complex people experiencing complex pain in complex worlds. And being able to say, this is what I know, this is what I don't know, this is what we can try. What would you like to try moving forward? I think that's a better approach than the one that I experienced as a patient, where everything was given to me with such certainty in retrospect, and being able to reflect back now, I know that there wasn't certainty associated with those recommendations, and I had no say in it whatsoever. I was just told what to do and when to do it. I wasn't an active participant in my care at all. And I liked all of my clinicians. I want to make that very clear too. I liked all of my healthcare professionals. They were great people. I personally got along with them, and I really wanted the treatments to work because I liked them too. I wanted to be able to say, yeah, I feel better today, but I didn't. I wouldn't feel better, or I'd feel better momentarily, like while I was there doing things that made me feel like myself. I mean, one of the other things too, I never complained about being on the treadmill, the bike, or the stair mill. I never complained about strength training because that was all stuff I loved doing. That was who I was. I was someone who worked a very physical job and worked out at work, and then got off work at 7 o'clock in the morning and went straight to the gym, and I would be at the gym for 4 hours. Like, I was that person. I was annoying. Like, I was that person that would tell you all about how to work out and all of those sorts of things. I was a strength and conditioning coach, so I developed plans for other firefighters. So all of that supported my biases too, and I loved doing it, but it wasn't what I needed.
And Joletta, based on what you just said, maybe you reinforced the wrong thinking of the professionals, because you said, well, I was the athlete, I was the one who liked doing those exercises, and you didn't say anything about it. So maybe you reinforced their thinking.
I just did what they told me to do. I mean, none of them knew I was an athlete. They knew I was a firefighter because I was there because of a firefighter, but no one knew my history at that time. They just knew I was a firefighter that had hip pain.
They didn't ask you what you wanted. Like now in the Netherlands, the concept of how do you call it? Ownership, autonomy, self-management is hot. And it means that, well, we first have to ask the client. They did not use that.
No, I was never asked.
Yeah.
Because I would not have done the treadmill. Maybe. I'm just kidding. But no, I wasn't asked. I was always just told what to do back then. I mean, this was also 11 years ago when my injury first happened in January 2010. But in like the goal setting and everything like that was done for me. I was never included in that process. I was given it on a sheet of paper, what my goals were. So they were just handed to me. I didn't have any say in creating them back then. And I'm hoping that things have changed now here in the US as well.
Well, at least you're definitely advocating for it. That makes it sense, because you give meaning and you give kind of a lot of direction to it, how it goes, and especially what kind of influences there were and there are. Sien, you had a question.
Yes, you touched on this a little bit, but did you get the feeling that they said your pain was your fault, that you need to work on it? And how do you think we could avoid that?
That's such a great question too. I think we very much operate within kind of a personal responsibility model of pain, that your pain is your fault, and then if treatment doesn't work, that is also your fault. You know, that's kind of what patients are made to believe. How do we change that is a great question. I wish I had a better answer for it. I think in part, I think change needs to take place at a lot of different levels, including the knowledge that healthcare professionals have about pain and what to do about it, which I think is changing. And it's beautiful to see what you all are doing there, because I think that that things are changing faster there than perhaps in other places. I think that what patients' understanding of pain needs to change too, and that can't just come in a one-on-one environment with one healthcare professional, with one clinician, with one therapist, because that's really hard to change someone's narrative, to change someone's beliefs about pain, whether that's like pain is my fault, or thinking that you're saying that pain is my fault, when they go back out into a world where those narratives are reinforced over and over again. So I think socially we need to work towards changing our understanding of pain too, where we do very much, at least here, have this notion of if you don't get better, you did something wrong. It's you didn't do your exercises enough. You didn't follow the plan like you were supposed to, rather than taking a view of this wasn't the right plan for you. You know, we put it on the person rather than the plan or the approach to treatment. And I think we also have this notion, narratives were brought up earlier, and Arthur Frank has 3 narratives about in the illness narratives: the chaos narrative, which we touched upon, which is when you can't make sense of anything, you can't really give voice to your story. Kind of the quest narrative, which is kind of where I am now, where you make meaning of your experiences and you use those experiences to do good. But the most common narrative in healthcare is the restoration narrative, where you're going to be restored to your former self. You are going to come to me for the problem. We are going to do this, and you are going to go back to who you were before this pain happened, or before, you know, this experience happened. And I think that type of narrative, where we go in with this expectation that we're going to be restored to our former self, where the healthcare professional has this expectation that they're going to restore people to their former health, contributes to that sense of blame, of failure. Because if someone isn't then restored, who's to blame for that? Is that a failure? And that we need to reconceptualize the entire thing. That we never go backwards. None of us ever go backwards. We're never restored to our former selves. This will always be a part of someone's experience and self moving forward. It will shape who they are from this point forward. So that maybe we need to just reframe how we think about what care is and what treatment is designed to do. And maybe it's not getting back to who the person was, but figuring out who the person is and can be. And then failure doesn't become a part of that. You know, then it can be built upon redefining success in different ways. It's not this treatment doing X, it's this person living the life that they want to live, whether pain is present or not. But that's such a hard one, and it's part of that whole, you know, justice aspect of things too, where patients are often blamed for their pain or blamed for their circumstances, rather than taking a more, I think we give biopsychosocial, like that word or that framework, a lot of lip service, but we don't actually practice it because we don't focus very much on the social, and we make everything very personal. It's the way this person moves and thinks and is in the world without really taking into account the world. And that's a huge shift that needs to take place, that I think can be done at individual levels in some sense, to make it clear that this person is not to blame for their pain. That could be explicitly said, like, your pain is not your fault. You know, if it's something that someone is feeling in that time, because that was something I struggled with too. I very much felt like my pain was my fault, and that my not being able to get better was my fault. And that's why there was so much shame associated with that, because I should have been better and I wasn't. And so I had to have been the failure in that. I was the common link between all of these failed treatments. And I don't know what it took to get over that, other than understanding pain differently. You know, that it is more complex, that I wasn't responsible for my pain, that what I was responsible for was how I moved forward with it. So.
In education and in workshops, I often turn it around. I often say, when the pain is still there, it is the fault of the professional, first of all. Because we need to get a better understanding. If we don't understand you or other clients, we cannot give you well, the coaching or the treatment that fits to you as a person. And instead of saying, well, the client is not motivated, the client cannot change, well, it's of course a little bit tricky to say that. I often start with, well, when the pain is there, still there, it is first of all our fault as a professional. I'm curious what you think about it, but also how Joost and Els and the others are thinking about it.
For me, I think I don't want to blame anyone, because that implies that there is a fix and that we just haven't found it yet. And so someone has to be blamed for it. And that maybe that is not true. Maybe it isn't something that hasn't been uncovered by the clinician. Maybe it's something that is just yet to emerge. And so for me, blame, I think, shouldn't be in the equation. It's the situation itself that is the difficult thing, that is the challenge, that is the process that needs to be worked through. Because I think it would be really hard, I think, as a healthcare professional to take on that blame when patients don't get better. That's not their responsibility. I wouldn't want them to burden themselves with the outcome, because the outcome is unpredictable, and it's not dependent on any one person or one thing. It's dependent on a lot of different things.
I think it's, as you said, Joletta and Tom, it's an interesting and intriguing element to talk about responsibility. I noticed also what Joletta is saying, is it responsibility? How is there? I notice I have some difficulties with responsibility and guilt. We definitely come into a kind of an almost religious level. On is there a kind of guilt? Do we have to blame somebody? Is the pain a commodity, or is it something which is because that's also kind of the case, that this kind of commodity that you get and you can push it away again. So it's kind of I got a cup, this is the pain, and I can take it away again. So it's something that you have or have not or something, or is it? What does it feel? Because it feels to me quite a lot also in an interaction, not so much as an interaction, but an interaction between all the elements present. Although everything is more than just the elements. It's a reaction. It's a reaction between a lot of things. Also, what I hear from the stories, it's something that you, within the interaction between the two persons, the environment, the situation, the context, and everything, something emerges and probably it changes. And that's also what I think in this case, well, talking before with Joletta and all the times when reading new stuff, how important it also is that we really collaborate with each other. It's not so much as a therapist-patient, it is two different parts who are kind of interact with each other, and that should be the same thing, I would say, with education. It's an analogy everywhere. It's within the system.
And I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
It should be a full cooperation, interaction.
Yeah.
But in the past, it was often the therapist who said about the patient, oh, the patient is not able to take my advice. The patient is not able to change. And to those old-fashioned therapists, I would like to say, first of all, it is your fault because you don't understand the patient. But of course, it should be full interaction. And when you have the feeling that you are not on the same level, then hopefully you can give each other information.
Yeah.
But then again, as a client, you should get the space to tell your story.
Oh yeah, but now I think this is something really interesting, Tom, what you mentioned.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, because I'm getting there. I have heard and also a lot of stories and research concerning the non-compliant patient.
Yeah.
Definitely would say we only have non-compliant therapists, because the moment you start blaming your client, then you have to look in the mirror first of all towards yourself, and isn't it?
And I have the feeling that was at least in the past what we often said about chronic pain patients. When it's complex, it is often the patient. I see it also in stroke rehabilitation with patients with cognitive disorders. They are not able to understand me. No, I am not able to understand the complex problems of a client. And I think there is an important thing that we have to do in education to, I don't know if you really can unravel the complexity, but at least do it a little bit.
Putting it in that context, I wholly agree with that. And it makes me even think about myself. Back when I was a firefighter, I was a peer fitness trainer too, where I designed workout programs essentially for both our firefighting staff and then also our staff, our civilian staff, just people who worked at headquarters and whatnot. And for me back then, I used to think whatever their goal was, my workout plan for them was the solution. Because no matter what your goal in life is, all you have to do is lift heavy shit and it fixes everything. All you have to do is work out. So that I definitely was not reflective at that time of when people then didn't do it for whatever reason or didn't experience success for whatever reason. I was like, oh, they just don't have the time or they're not motivated. Like I had all of those beliefs myself of those people. And it was only upon going through my own experience where I challenged some of those beliefs about people and motivation and all these things, and realizing that people just weren't motivated to do what I did. And why would they be? Like, these are my interests, the things that I enjoy doing. It's not universally applicable to everybody. And yet I tried to force that on people back then. And it was only through, so I was at fault then, definitely. That was definitely my fault.
In the meantime, we've got some questions, although I think that we covered most of them in this, because there's a lot of questions concerning what have people been doing right as a healthcare professional. And actually, you mentioned quite a lot of the questions that's also put in the chat on YouTube. So I'm not going to put them down here at the moment because you answered them, maybe not completely explicitly, but implicitly there are questions there. I just want to ask you, you mentioned several times testimonial injustice, ethical justice. So there are two things that I definitely like to talk a little bit. There's just one word, and we talked about it before, and in Dutch we have something which is called hulpvraag, the help-seeking question. And definitely in physiotherapy education, that's something that probably I think I just have to look upon all the upcoming colleagues who are sitting in this team. You know this question, help-seeking question, the hulpvraag. It's something that a lot of education is forced upon. That's the thing that you have to ask. But I'm very keen on knowing, what do you think about it?
It's interesting, and when we talked about this before, I had reframed it because you were talking about how it doesn't have a direct English translation.
Yeah.
As kind of like, tell me your problem, or why are you here to see me today, kind of thing. Like, those are the kinds of questions that we get in the US, which then makes it very kind of problem focused. What do you want me to help you with? Rather than who are you, and determining like, who are you coming to see me, rather than what are you coming to see me for? And it's just kind of a different framing of it that I think can change that interaction a little bit. For me, one of the most profound moments of my whole pain, I hate the word like pain journey, but my journey through all of this, my experience through all of this was being a patient demo for Peter O'Sullivan. And I didn't do any research, so I didn't know anything about him. I didn't know what to expect. I was just going in as I was going to be this patient demo at a conference. And the first thing he asked me was to tell him my story. So, and I didn't know how to respond to that, because during my healthcare, I had never been asked to tell my story. I never had started a healthcare interaction with tell me your story. So I was like, where do you want me to begin? Because I was expecting to be directed to my specific problem, what I was there to see him for, my help seeking problem, you know? And he said, wherever you would like. I was like, just anything, I can talk about anything. And it was really interesting because at that time I was having pain in my left hip. That was why I was there. I had been having pain in my left hip, my good hip, which I try not to call it that because I don't want to make judgments on my hips. But my good hip, I had been having pain in for 7 months. And I had gradually stopped doing things again. Like I wasn't running anymore. I was starting to limit my activity and all these things, but and convincing myself that this was all fine and good. So that's what I'm there to see him for. When he asked me to tell him my story, and this is 7 years after stepping off the fire engine, I said, 7 years ago, I stepped off a fire engine, felt this twinge in my hip, went down this path of ongoing worsening pain that completely upended my life and upended my sense of self. And I lost my career, I lost my friends, I lost my financial security, lost all of these things. That was the story that I told. And in just being able to tell that story, I recognized what my problem was, which wouldn't, if I was told, like, why are you here to see me today? I would have said, I've been having this pain in my left hip. It's like a C pattern. It hurts here, it hurts here, it hurts more when I do this. I don't run anymore. I would have done any of this. I wouldn't have mentioned all the other stuff. But by going back and telling that story of my first experience, I recognized why I was so worried about what was going on in my left hip. I was worried. I had rebuilt my life at that time. I had started a nonprofit. I was doing this advocacy work. I was snowboarding again. I was out in nature again, camping again, going on road trips again. I was able to sit. I was able to do all these things. I had rebuilt my life and myself and my personhood and all of that. And I was terrified that I was going to lose it all again. But I had never given voice to that tear. I had never given voice to that worry, even to myself. I had never even said to myself, this is why this is so concerning to you. So I think when we limit the conversation to what is your problem, or what are you here to see me for today, or why are you seeking my help today, we make it specific about that body part. It becomes part-centered again, or problem-centered again, and it's not patient-centered. And by being able to just tell my story, I was able to connect my own dots. Like, oh, this is what I'm so worried about. And then he was able to reassure me that based on we did some movement experiments and stuff like that. And he would question me because he's like, if your hip was really unstable, would you be able to snowboard? Probably not. Like if my femur was going to fly out of my hip socket, would I be able to fly down a mountain on a plank? Probably not. So like just through some questioning and through some movement experiments, like he had me do all these squats and lunges and stuff in a flexed position, because I'm always, especially when I'm in pain, I get more and more hyperextended. I sit more and more upright. I revert back to kind of that good posture that is ingrained in me. Not just societally, we have these good posture notions, but then as a firefighter, you literally stand at attention and sit at attention in those things. So it was very ingrained in me. So like being able to walk through that, he was able to address those fears, those concerns, that thing that worried me the most, and say, I don't think that that's going to happen again. Like, and that was what I needed. I didn't need anything specific really for my left hip. And I got back to running again. And it was really interesting because my husband and I walked our dog Buster along this river trail by our house. And I was going to go for a run that afternoon. I was going to test out my hip after this interaction with Pete. And as I was walking, so we had just walked on this trail. I was fine. My hip was fine. Everything was fine. As I was walking back to the same trail to go for a run, my pain started going through the roof. And I was like, oh, like you biopsychosocial person, you like all of this has nothing to do with the structure of my hip. Nothing is going on in the structure of my hip for my pain to go up before I even start running. It had nothing to do with the running whatsoever. It had to do with all of this other context and story and history and all of that stuff. And so then I run, and I was trying to be all relaxed because I tend to get really tense and braced and rigid when my pain goes up. So I was trying to be more relaxed, and I was trying to run floppy and that kind of stuff. But it was that recognition and being able to give voice to my own experience in any way that I wanted to, where I hit upon right away the thing that worried me the most. That was what came out of my mouth. But if it was phrased differently, if it was, what are you here to see me for today? Yeah. It would have been an entirely different conversation and probably an entirely different outcome as well.
It really makes sense. Well, concerning time, and I think that we can talk for hours, and we definitely like to ask you back for the next conversation, because this is an unfinished conversation. But to be honest, Joletta, that's the thing we always have. We always end up in an unfinished conversation and not in a finished one. Knowing the time and also the amount of effort most of us have been during the day.
Yes. I just want to thank you all. I know it's been a really long day for all of you, so I just want to thank you for sticking around for this session, and I really appreciate it.
Oh, we really appreciate very, very much that you, well, we were lucky that you will share your insight with us, and this is of such a great value, and it will definitely do something else.
And for me, you are still the firefighter. I see a fighter, I see fire in your stories. So for me, you are still a firefighter.
Thank you.
So, and I think that we will definitely be in contact, and I hope within not so much time that we will have an extra conversation concerning justice-related elements and patient participation in education and research, and why it's important from your perspective. So we move a little bit from the micro to the more meso-macro level, if you agree with me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, thank you very much. Is there something, if you just, although we're closing, if you are able now to just give one question to all the healthcare profession to think about, what would you challenge them with?
So I would challenge, and it doesn't have to be in a healthcare setting. It doesn't have to be specifically involved with patients, but my challenge is less a reflection and more an exercise to just listen. It can be a friend, it can be a family member, it can be a patient, but to just listen and sit back and try not to respond. Just listen and see how it goes, because it's really hard. It can be really hard and challenging to just listen to someone without formulating a response, without thinking, this is what I'm going to say, and when I get my turn, this is what I'm going to say, and just listen to that person without interrupting them at all. And see how that goes, and then maybe reflect on that a little bit. And then if you are into a reflective practice, asking how you can bring that into the patient environment as well, or the clinical environment as well. Like if it is possible to just lead with an open-ended question and then just sit back and listen, and potentially not fill any silence that might come too. Because there might be some silence. The person might not be willing to share, but they will always start to fill that silence if you stay quiet and see if you feel comfortable with that, uncomfortable with that, and explore maybe reasons why, and if it's possible to experiment with a little bit.
Oh, thank you. This is really a nice challenge. I promise you now, the next time we meet, we're coming back to this reflection, isn't it? Yes, I see some nodding faces. We're definitely going to be back in this one. And then we hear how it goes. Well, thank you very much, Joletta. A big applause from all of us, and thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you all.
And we